Hi, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of American Criminal. In our latest season, the child of Italian immigrants sets out to achieve the American dream. And if he has to spill some blood along the way, so be it. Listen to American Criminal Al Capone wherever you get your podcasts. Or to get ad-free access to the entire season first, subscribe at intohistory.com.
It's a cold summer night in 1884, outside Nolan's Hotel in Mingus, Montana. A weary traveler strides through the streets, exhausted from the road. He's had a rough year. He recently lost his mother and his wife. To escape the pain, the traveler has treated himself to a private sojourn, a horseback ride through the badlands and prairies of the Dakota and Montana territories. He's been riding long and hard. Tonight, there's only one thing his heart desires: a quiet drink. But as the traveler approaches the entrance to the hotel's tavern, 2 gunshots ring out from inside. It's one of these places. The traveler stops in his tracks, annoyed. There's clearly trouble in the tavern, but it's a cold night and there's nowhere else to go, so he pushes open the door and walks in anyway. Inside, there's a small group of customers and a lone bartender doing his best to deal with an unruly drunk, a shabby-looking fellow in a broad hat with 2 cocked guns, one in each hand. He sees the traveler walk in. "Hey, Four Eyes, you thirsty?" The traveler is used to people making fun of his glasses. It's been a recurring theme throughout his life, but tonight he's not in the mood. So he ignores the drunk fellow and slides up to the bar. "A drink, please." But the drunk doesn't give up. He stumbles toward the traveler and calls out, "Yeah, get Four Eyes here a drink. As a matter of fact, Four Eyes is going to treat everyone here to a round." The traveler laughs it off and gets some distance from the drunken fellow. He sits in the corner of the room by the stove. As he warms his hands, the traveler notices a clock hanging on the wall, littered with bullet holes. He shakes his head in disgust. Just then, he feels the drunken fellow slide in behind him. "Hey, listen, you son of a bitch. When I say you're buying around, you're buying around. Got it?" The traveler's patience has worn thin. He slowly stands and calmly replies, "Well, if I've got to, I've got to." Traveler clenches his knuckles and throws a swift, hard right to the drunk's jaw. As the drunk recoils, both his pistols go off. Luckily, no one's hit. The traveler quickly throws 2 more punches, a quick left and a hard right. As the drunk falls to the ground, the traveler snatches his guns. And on the way to the floor, the drunk's head smacks against the bar top. His body goes limp and hits the hardwood with a loud thud. This drunk picked a fight with the wrong man. A natural fighter, the four-eyed traveler took an interest in martial arts early on and carried that obsession with him into adulthood. He studied various disciplines, from boxing to kendo, from wrestling to judo. He would practice them his entire life, first as a student at Harvard University, then as governor of New York, and finally as vice president of the United States under President William McKinley. After McKinley's tragic assassination, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt would become America's 26th president. But to keep the White House in the election of 1904, Teddy would have to win the fight on the campaign trail. Wicked Game is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's been especially busy around the studio this month. We launched a new podcast with another one coming, so trying to find the time to get everything done has been a challenge. There sometimes just aren't enough hours in the day, you know? But what if there was? What if someone gave you a 25th hour? How would you use it? You could sleep in. You could actually take a lunch maybe. You could go on a walk. I mean, this is the most precious, limited resource we have, time. A lot of us wish we had more time, but you need to ask, time for what? Do you know what's important to you and how to make it a priority? Therapy can help find what matters to you so you can do more of it. And as the world's largest therapy service, BetterHelp has matched 3 million people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. Plus, it's affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist. But if things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. Couldn't be simpler. No waiting rooms, no traffic. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/elections today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, wickedgame.com/elections. Wicked Game is sponsored by Factor. It's been a busy month for me. We launched a new podcast with another one coming soon, all while keeping 6 others that we work on going strong. So I'll be frank, it's been stressful and time-consuming. What could be a perfect storm of conditions to ruin my healthy eating habits. It's so easy to go grab drive-thru, right? But I didn't, because there's Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit. Chef-prepared, dietitian-approved, ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door, with over 35 different options every week to choose from, including keto, calorie smart, vegan, veggie, all the ways you want to eat healthy. And there's even more to enjoy, with over 55 nutrition-packed add-ons that'll help make your weekly meal planning even more delicious. And I'm dead serious when I tell you they hit the spot. Not only are they tasty, but satisfying, something you don't often get in nutritious food. Plus, it's all ready in just 2 minutes. No prep, no mess. Perfect for your most busy, stressful times, and all the rest, too. Head to factormeals.com/wickedgame50 and use code WICKEDGAME50 to get 50% off. That's code WICKEDGAME50 at factormeals.com/wickedgame50 to get 50% off. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. Theodore Roosevelt did not like the name Teddy. In fact, he despised it. But he was a larger-than-life man with a larger-than-life personality, and despite his distaste for it, the name stuck. It was a rare example of Teddy not getting his way. As a young boy, Teddy was weak, frail, and sickly, but he devoted his time and energy to developing physical and mental strength. Not only was he a martial arts enthusiast and an athlete, he was a published author by the age of 18. By 23, he was a renowned historian and New York State Assemblyman. By 38, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and at 39, he was the colonel of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, known as the Rough Riders. Roosevelt and his Rough Riders played a central role in the U.S. victory in the Spanish-American War. His valor and bravery on the field of battle launched his political career and made Roosevelt a household name. This national renown catapulted him all the way to the vice presidency. But on September 6, 1901, at the Temple of Music in Buffalo, New York, President William McKinley was shot twice in the belly by the anarchist Leon Czolgosz. At first, it appeared McKinley would recover. Roosevelt himself was confident of this. So shortly after the assassination attempt, Roosevelt left Buffalo to join his family on a trip to the Adirondack Mountain Range in New York. McKinley's condition, though, took a turn for the worse. On September 14th, while Roosevelt was climbing Mount Tahalus, a guide delivered him a telegram. It read, "The president is critically ill. His condition is grave. Oxygen is being given. Absolutely no hope." Almost immediately, Roosevelt began the 400-mile-long journey back to Buffalo, traveling down the mountain on foot, then journeying southwest across New York's mountainous terrain by carriage, and finally arriving in Buffalo by train. While on the journey, Roosevelt had remarked to a traveling companion, "If it had been I who had been shot, he wouldn't have gotten away so easily. I'd have guzzled him first." By the thrust of an assassin's bullet, Teddy Roosevelt became America's 5th accidental president. He would use every ounce of grit, determination, and strength in him to deliver results for the country and make the office his own. In the 1904 contest, the Democrats would learn a hard lesson about Teddy Roosevelt, the same lesson learned by the drunk man in the Montana tavern. Anyone standing in Teddy's way was bound to take a beating. This is episode 30, 1904, Parker versus Roosevelt, Rough Rider. It's Saturday, September 14th, 1901, at the Wilcox Mansion in Buffalo, New York. This opulent property is one of Buffalo's crown jewels, but today, the pristine facade of the white building is draped in black. In the library inside, Vice President Teddy Roosevelt stands in front of a small crowd of witnesses, mostly statesmen and members of the late President McKinley's cabinet. The emotion in the room is palpable as the clock on the wall strikes 3:30 p.m. President McKinley's Secretary of War, Elihu Root, whispers something into Roosevelt's ear. Roosevelt nods and watches as Root takes his place at the front of the library and addresses the room. Mr. Vice President, But Root can't contain his emotion. He chokes up as he tries to speak the words. Roosevelt's face is stern as the Secretary of War weeps quietly for a full minute. Finally, Root musters the strength to continue. I have been asked, on behalf of the cabinet of the late president, to request that for reasons of weight affecting the administration of the government, you should proceed to take the constitutional oath of the President of the United States. Roosevelt bows. He clears his throat. As he addresses the room, his voice quivers too. I shall take the oath at once. Roosevelt has just come from the Milburn House, where President McKinley's body rests. He was unable to see him, as the First Lady was too overcome with grief. Roosevelt, too, feels the conflicting emotions swelling inside him. He always wanted the presidency, but not like this. He does his best to hold it together as he speaks. In this hour of deep and terrible national bereavement, I wish to state that it shall be my aim. The emotion almost overtakes him. He shakes his shoulders, pulls back his head, and fights through it. It'll be my aim to continue absolutely unbroken the policy of President McKinley for the peace, the prosperity, and the honor of our beloved country. After taking the oath of office, Teddy Roosevelt became the nation's 26th president. His inaugural speech was the shortest in American history, though he was not entirely its author. When the clock struck 3:30, Secretary of War Root whispered into his ear and suggested Roosevelt declare his intention to continue unbroken the policy of President McKinley. Roosevelt took Root's words to heart. After the ceremony, he silently bowed and dismissed the crowd. There was no applause or fanfare, no congratulatory words, only solemn handshakes and reverent silence for the late president. As one observer would later write, I have witnessed many of the world's pageants in my time, but they all seem to me tawdry and insignificant in the presence of that little company in the library of the Wilcox House in Buffalo. In the early 20th century, political divides in America had been sharpening and widening for decades. As two-time Democratic nominee William Jennings Bryan once wrote, the extremes of society are being driven further and further apart. These divides were apparent. Labor versus business, isolationism versus expansionism, nativists versus immigrants. In the presidential elections of the late 19th century, these stark divides had caused most politicians to avoid taking a stand on the complicated issues facing the torn nation. President McKinley had been, by all accounts, an establishment man. He was friendly to Wall Street and big business, and like most politicians of his era, he did not take a strong position on the many social and political ills that plagued the country during his presidency. During his inauguration, Roosevelt had promised to continue McKinley's policies and fulfill his presidential legacy. But once he was president, Roosevelt would go his own way. Roosevelt kept McKinley's cabinet in place, but he would not make good on his promise to stick to the McKinley script. He would abandon McKinley's policies and become in part a champion of progressivism, a diverse political movement that rallied around the idea that government should play a central role in solving society's problems. In September of 1901, there was already evidence that people wanted change, especially on the issue of elections. Key figures in several Western states demanded an overhaul of the electoral process. The progressives in these states felt that the party bosses in Washington had too much power and had too often neglected their constituents. These progressives wanted to replace the national convention system with primary elections, a process where voters could directly decide the presidential nominee of their party. Many progressives also wanted to vote directly for their senators, and they wanted the people to have the power to pass laws over Congress through public referendums. In various states, including Wisconsin and Ohio, a handful of these progressive candidates were winning elections. Many in Washington dismissed them, writing off the progressive movement as nothing more than a flash in the pan. But Teddy Roosevelt saw it differently. He saw that progressivism had the potential to swell into a national movement, and indeed it did. In the early 1900s, several states adopted presidential primaries, the first of which was Florida. Two basic modes of primary elections emerged: delegate primaries and preference primaries. Delegate primaries allowed voters to directly select delegates for their party's national convention. In a preference primary, convention delegates were legally required to vote for the candidate who had won the primary election. Progressives also successfully pushed for other election reforms, including secret ballots and further implementation of automatic voting machines. The secret ballot was especially important to progressives because it undercut the influence of party bosses and lessened the impact of long-standing electioneering tactics like vote buying, poll bullying, and voter intimidation. The progressive movement, though, was not confined to election reform. Progressives sought change across a myriad of issues: corruption, women's suffrage, prison reform, public health, education, prohibition, and civil liberties. Teddy was not on board for the full progressive agenda. He lacked the political will and support to fully tackle divisive issues like Jim Crow and women's suffrage. But Teddy did make strides. As governor of New York, he had ended school segregation. As president, he appointed progressive judges and encouraged the prosecution of civil rights offenders in the South. And in the coal strike of 1902, when the United Mine Workers of America went on strike, Teddy made history by becoming the first president to intervene in a labor dispute. At Teddy's behest, the government successfully negotiated an end to the strike. The workers got a pay raise and shorter workday. The owners earned a higher price for coal, but not everyone was happy with Teddy's intervention. Many progressives felt he hadn't done enough. Many on Wall Street felt he had gone too far. As one on Wall Street put it, Teddy seemed in favor of a pronounced type of socialism. If Teddy, the accidental president, was already pushing this hard on behalf of labor, Teddy, the elected president, would be even more emboldened and even more dangerous to their bottom line. The question was, who could beat him, though? For many on Wall Street, including the famous banker J.P. Morgan, the answer was obvious: Ohio Senator Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna, the aging senator from Ohio, was not a career politician. In fact, he had spent most of his career as a successful businessman. He was a junior senator in Ohio, but his special friendship with President McKinley and his ties to Wall Street had given him immense power. Hanna was also chairman of the Republican National Convention, which gave him control over the Republicans' nominating process as well as their finances. And as a senator under McKinley, he had overseen White House patronage, doling out jobs and perks to supporters loyal to the party. By 1903, Hanna knew Wall Street wanted him to challenge Teddy. And while he had no love for Teddy Roosevelt, calling him a damn cowboy, deep down, Hanna didn't want the job. He was getting old, and he was in poor health, racked with terrible fits of melancholy and arthritis. For him, the job of president was too much show and not enough substance. Hanna believed that the real power in Washington was in the Senate and being a good friend of the president. So Hanna had determined that the best way to keep his power in the Senate was to stay on Teddy's good side. But Hanna's Senate seat was up for grabs in 1904. So as Wall Street sought to push Hanna towards a presidential run, Hanna sought to use the rumors of his potential candidacy to his advantage in his own race. These rumors helped Hanna win a turf war in the Buckeye State that had been brewing for years with Ohio's other senator. Joseph Foraker, Ohio's senior senator, was an ambitious man, and he had been a thorn in Mark Hanna's side throughout his time in the Senate. Foraker wanted to seize the levers of power from Mark Hanna and position himself for a presidential run down the line, possibly in the election of 1908. The best way to achieve that goal was to curry favor with President Roosevelt in the hope that Teddy might make Foraker his heir apparent. In May of 1903, at the Ohio State Republican Convention, Foraker made his big move. In a surprise to almost everyone, including Hanna, Foraker made a motion for the Ohio delegation to endorse Teddy Roosevelt's candidacy a full year before the convention. This put Hanna in a tough spot. If he challenged Foraker by opposing the motion, it might cause a rift with Teddy. If he let it pass, not only would he be handing a huge leadership win to Foraker, he would be publicly declaring he did not intend to run against Teddy in 1904, thus endangering the support from his friends on Wall Street. So Hanna sent Roosevelt a telegram. It read, "The issue which has been forced on me in the matter of our state convention this year, endorsing you for the Republican nomination next year, has come in a way which makes it necessary for me to oppose such a resolution. When you know all the facts, I'm sure you will approve my course. M.A. Hanna." When Teddy received this telegram, he was traveling America's West Coast, making speeches and attending public events. Teddy fully understood that his nomination was not a foregone conclusion. Prior to Teddy, none of America's accidental presidents had won their party's nomination in the following election. Teddy also knew that Hanna was his biggest competition and the biggest threat. But as always, Teddy was ready for the fight. He sent Hanna a reply, "Your telegram received. I have not asked any man for his support. I've had nothing whatever to do with raising the issue. Those who favor my administration and my nomination will favor endorsing both, and those who do not will oppose. Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy's reply, which he leaked to the press, forced Hanna to make a decision early. In the end, Hanna feared Teddy more than Wall Street. He immediately backed down, telling the press, "I shall not oppose action by the convention, and I have telegraphed the president to that effect." By tacitly backing Teddy, Hanna had turned his back on Wall Street, and Teddy had secured the de facto endorsement of his greatest rival. But Wall Street was not ready to give up. In the winter of 1903, one Wall Street man would try a last time to convince Hanna to throw his hat into the ring. J.P. Morgan would flex his muscles, seek to deprive Teddy of the Republican nomination, and deliver the election of 1904 to Wall Street. Wicked Game is sponsored by NetSuite. Here's some quick and easy math. The less your business spends on operations, on multiple systems, on delivering your product or service, the more profit you have and the more money you keep. But with higher expenses on materials, employees, distribution, and borrowing, everything costs more these days. So to reduce costs and the headaches associated with them, switch to NetSuite, the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, all into one platform and one source of truth. And with NetSuite, you'll also reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud, no hardware required, and accessible from anywhere. You cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because now you've got one unified business management suite. And you improve efficiency by bringing all of your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move, so do the math for yourself. See how you'll profit with NetSuite this year. Now through April 15th, NetSuite is offering a one-of-a-kind flexible financing program. Head to netsuite.com/elections. That's netsuite.com/elections. netsuite.com/elections.
At the time, I only felt a punch.
I think everything went wrong.
His drug of choice was heroin.
Binging and purging over and over and over.
Evaluate you, and if you're okay to go, they're going to let you go.
This is Justin, and I do the Peripheral podcast. I have a true crime background, but when telling the stories of true crime, sometimes you have to gloss over topics like mental illness, drug addiction, sexual assault. And I feel like we do that in life too. So this podcast is my attempt to bring all of these topics that are on the peripheral into the mainstream. So please join me wherever you listen to podcasts.
It's Thanksgiving, 1903, at the home of J.P. Morgan in New York. Morgan holds court and entertains his guests over a turkey dinner, but this is not strictly a social gathering. As is always the case with J.P. Morgan, everything is business. Morgan has invited Senator Mark Hanna and his wife, Charlotte Augusta, to spend the holiday with him. In the middle of the meal, Morgan leans over to Senator Hanna and gets down to the business at hand. The country's falling apart, Senator. These are trying times indeed. That's the understatement of the century. The rail yards are filled with empty cars. People all across the country are out of work. Mill workers to boilermen. Between the riots, the protests, and the declining wages, the people are starting to lose faith, Senator. The Republican Party is coming apart at the seams, and Teddy Roosevelt is tearing at the fabric. We need a candidate to bring us together. I've just won re-election, Mr. Morgan. I will do what I can for my place in the Senate. Is it true Roosevelt asked you to run his campaign? It is, indeed. Hanna was bothered by Teddy's suggestion that he stay on as chairman of the Republican convention and spearhead his campaign. It was a transparent attempt to keep him on the sidelines. Though he had no intention of seeking the nomination, it was still insulting. Well, aren't you tired of going to the White House with your hand over your heart, Senator? Aren't you tired of pledging allegiance to Teddy Roosevelt? The truth is, Hanna is exhausted, in poor health too. He's tired of being caught in the middle of a fight between Teddy and Wall Street. The last thing he wants is to be involved in the 1904 contest, not as a potential nominee and not as head of the Republican committee. But Hanna doesn't answer the question. He doesn't say a word. But ever persistent, Morgan leans over to Hanna's wife, Charlotte. Ma'am, your husband could be nominated easily. If only he would give the word. Charlotte glances at her husband's weary face for a moment before giving Morgan her answer. He will not put forth his name, Mr. Morgan, and nothing anyone says will convince him otherwise. I should know. In the winter of 1903, Hanna's mind was made up. Fresh off a successful re-election campaign, Hanna was determined to end his career in the Senate. Still, despite his multiple declinations, Teddy Roosevelt still feared a last-minute Hanna nomination. So in December of 1903, Teddy summoned Hanna to the White House to put the matter to rest once and for all. Mark Hanna was irritated that Teddy wanted him to stay on as convention chair, but he was upset about something else, too. Teddy wanted to promote a man named Leonard Wood to the rank of Major General. Wood was Hanna's political enemy, someone who had previously thrown one of Hanna's key supporters in jail for fraud. But he was also one of Teddy's close friends. Wood had served under Teddy as a member of the Rough Riders in Cuba, and Teddy felt he owed Wood the promotion. Still, Teddy was smart enough to know that an angry Mark Hanna constituted a legitimate threat to his nomination. So in early December, Teddy summoned Hanna to the White House to make peace. There, on December 4th, the two men struck a deal. Hanna would be relieved of the vexing job of serving as chairman of the Republican National Committee. In exchange, Hanna wouldn't fight Wood's promotion. And with a handshake, Teddy prevented a feud with Hanna and forged a clear path to the Republican nomination. With this new detente between Teddy and Hanna, resistance from Wall Street slowly began to fade. In February of 1904, J.P. Morgan's dream of a Mark Hanna presidency faded forever when Hanna was diagnosed with typhoid fever. He passed away on February 15, 1904. In the wake of Hanna's death, Teddy's path to the nomination was all but assured until the summer of 1904, when international events in northern Africa threatened Teddy's candidacy. In 1904, the U.S. was inching toward a larger role on the international stage. The British Empire was on the decline, and America looked poised to take its place as the global superpower. The previous summer, Teddy Roosevelt had made a big move in Central America. After pressuring the nation of Colombia to hand over the province of Panama to a new U.S.-friendly government there, Teddy pushed for the creation of the Panama Canal, a boon to U.S. trade and to Wall Street. Teddy's success in Panama had helped quiet the fears of many on Wall Street, and it had shown that the U.S. was ready to be a major player on the international scene. But then, in the summer of 1904, Teddy's international strength would face a major test in what would come to be called the Perdicaris incident. On May 18, 1904, a Greek-American citizen named Ian Perdicaris and his stepson were kidnapped by a Moroccan brigand named Ahmed ibn Muhammad Razuli at Perdicaris' home in Tangier. Razuli demanded money and political favors in exchange for the release of the hostages. On May 19th, a cable reached Washington. Mr. Perdicaris, most prominent American citizen here, and his stepson were carried off last night from their country house, 3 miles from Tangier, by a numerous band of natives headed by Razuli. Teddy Roosevelt's response was swift. In a turn of good fortune, he had recently sent 16 ships to patrol the Mediterranean. Immediately after receiving word of Perdicaris' kidnapping, Teddy dispatched several of them to the coast of Tangier. On May 28th, Teddy received Razuli's list of demands. He had hoped to save Perdicaris' life, but ultimately agreed with his Secretary of State's assessment. A nation cannot degrade itself to prevent ill treatment of a citizen. So instead, Teddy dispatched more ships to Tangier. He ordered his Secretary of State to send a stern message to his commanders. President wishes everything possible done to secure the release of Perdicaris. He wishes it clearly understood that if Perdicaris is murdered, this government will demand the life of the murderer. Teddy Roosevelt knew that the Perdicaris incident brought to bear some political differences inside the Republican Party. Many Republicans were not in favor of Teddy's so-called imperialistic posture. These detractors might have argued that the 16 ships Teddy had sent to the Mediterranean never should have been there in the first place. In addition, the idea of negotiating with aggressors was a hot-button issue that was bound to create disagreements. But Teddy was not worried about political blowback. On May 28th, he wrote, "I'd much rather be a real president for 3 years and a half than a figurehead for 7 years and a half." In the lead-up to the Republican convention, which was set to take place in June of 1904, Teddy felt confident that his response to the Perdicaris incident would not cost him politically, and for good reason. By May of 1904, over 2/3 of Republican delegates had already pledged to support his nomination. So on June 22nd at the Chicago Convention, as Perdicaris' fate hung in the balance, the convention chairman ordered the clerk to read a dispatch from Washington. It read, "We want either Perdicaris alive or Razuli dead." The hall erupted in cheers and chants for the president. The next day, the delegates nominated Teddy Roosevelt unanimously, winning all 994 votes. The following day, thanks to Teddy's firm posture, Perdicaris and his son-in-law were released. The remaining opposition in Wall Street, including J.P. Morgan, had no choice but to get on board and back Teddy. Coming out of the convention, Teddy had the support of Wall Street and a unified party behind him. So in July of 1904, the Democrats gathered at their national convention to mount an opposition to a president who looked increasingly unbeatable. The Democratic National Convention convened in St. Louis in July of 1904, and they selected for their nominee Chief Justice of the New York Court of Appeals, Alton B. Parker. Parker was largely seen as apolitical, a dangerous attribute in a candidate. As Teddy Roosevelt had written in May of 1904, the neutral-tinted individual is very apt to win against the man of pronounced views. After the convention, Parker received endorsements from several prominent publications, including the New York Evening Post, the New York Times, the Detroit Free Press, and the Boston Herald. This must have given Teddy cause for concern, for all of these newspapers had endorsed William McKinley in the 1900 contest. During the campaign, Teddy remained at the White House, focusing his attention on matters of state. Parker remained at his home in Esopus, New York. Both men left the work of the campaign to the leadership of their party's national conventions, and both pledged to stand firm behind their party's respective platforms. The Republicans pointed to significant achievements on the international stage under Teddy Roosevelt's leadership, most notably the Panama Canal Act. Republicans also claimed to be the party of economic prosperity, a prosperity bolstered by their support of protectionist tariffs, the gold standard, and a firm but fair hand with labor. The Democratic platform argued that Republican prosperity was not prosperity at all. It didn't benefit the American worker, only serving to line the pockets of Wall Street elites. Democrats painted Teddy Roosevelt as a usurper of the Constitution and an imperialist. President Parker, on the other hand, would be a return to good constitutional government. Still, Teddy Roosevelt was a popular president, and many predicted he would win in a landslide. As one senator wrote to Teddy, "Unless I am in a chloroformed state and merely dreaming, you are going to have the greatest victory since the Civil War." But not everyone was enthusiastic about Teddy Roosevelt. Among them was an Indiana man named Eugene Debs, a labor activist turned socialist. Debs had previously been the founder and president of the American Railroad Union. In the aftermath of the Pullman strike of 1894, a labor dispute between railroad workers and the powerful Pullman Company, Debs had been arrested. During his time in jail, he converted to socialism, and after his release, he founded what would become the Socialist Democratic Party of America. In the election of 1904, Debs would stand as the socialist candidate for president. In a speech in September of 1904, Debs said, "The capitalists made no mistake in nominating Mr. Roosevelt. They know him well, and he has served them well." Debs was not alone in his criticism. For many detractors, to find evidence of Teddy being in the pocket of big business, one needed to look no further than his running mate, Charles W. Fairbanks. This wealthy senator from Indiana was seen by many as a Wall Street stooge. In June of 1904, the New York Evening Post had written of Fairbanks, "Certainly the maddest anarchist would never think of killing Roosevelt to make Fairbanks president." For other grounds for his selection, however, one would search in vain. But Wall Street was still not sold on Teddy. Were it not for the peace deal he had struck with Senator Hanna, it's possible that Wall Street would have succeeded in denying him the nomination. But it wasn't just Fairbanks that caused alarm with Democrats and socialists. As the election drew near, Teddy's connections to Wall Street and big business would cause many to view him and his candidacy as corrupt. Teddy, as was his custom, would be ready for the fight to come. In the final stretch of the campaign, he would seek to deliver his detractors, Judge Parker and the Democratic Party, his infamous 1-2 punch. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com.
Gather round, friend, and join me by the fire. I have a secret to share. When I was a child, I lived with my grandma. She allowed me to watch unsolved mysteries. Fast forward to 2008, my freshman year of college. A series of armed robberies on campus escalated into a serial rapist's reign of terror. That's when I created my first crime podcast. In January 2014, I picked up the podcast again, from my college roommate who fell for an underage girl online, to the chilling story of a murdered nun in 1969 Baltimore, and in the Throwaway series, I share my own journey of overcoming homelessness and how that experience led me to unmask a serial killer and identify 3 of his Jane Doe victims. This is Foul Play Crime Series, where the stories are real and the truth is waiting to be discovered.
In the first part of September 1904, the Roosevelt Fairbanks ticket endured its first test in the gubernatorial elections in Vermont and Maine. Both elections resulted in Republican victories. Riding the momentum from the Maine-Vermont contests, Teddy released his official letter accepting the Republican nomination. He saw a chink in Judge Parker's armor, and in his acceptance letter, Teddy aimed to exploit it. During the Democratic convention, there had been some question as to whether Judge Parker would accept his party's nomination, mainly because the Democratic platform had not pledged itself to the gold standard. Parker had sent a cable stating, "I regard the gold standard as firmly established. As the platform is silent on the subject, my view should be made known to the convention, and if it is proved to be unsatisfactory to the majority, I request you to decline the nomination. Alton Parker." At the time, Teddy had called Parker's message a bold and skillful move to bend the Democrats to his will. But in the early fall of 1904, Teddy tried to use Parker's love for the gold standard to his own advantage. In his acceptance letter, Roosevelt wrote that the Democrats seem at a loss both as to what it is they really believe and as to how firmly they shall assert their belief in anything. For years, the Democrats had largely advocated for the introduction of silver into the gold-backed currency system. But now, at the behest of Parker, they were reversing course. To draw a contrast, Teddy wrote that Republicans base our appeal on what we have done and what we are doing. Men may differ from us, but they cannot accuse us of shiftiness or insincerity. Teddy promised the American people what he called a square deal. The campaign slogan was an instant sensation. The centerpiece of the campaign was Teddy's so-called 3 C's: conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. The Roosevelt campaign was riding high until, in early October, Joseph Pulitzer, the famous newspaperman, printed an explosive piece in the New York World, writing, "You have not kept the faith, Mr. President." According to Pulitzer, the Wall Street elites Teddy had promised to take on, men like J.P. Morgan, were the same men funding his campaign. "When they give something to your campaign," Pulitzer wrote, "they regard it as an implied promise of protection." In the article, Pulitzer asked 10 pointed questions. How much has the Beef Trust contributed? How much has the Paper Trust contributed? How much has the Coal Trust contributed? The questions went on and on from industry to industry, from tobacco to the railroads, and Pulitzer's 10 questions caught on like wildfire. Though his opponent, Judge Parker, never commented on the article, nearly everyone else did. Democratic operatives took the ball and ran with it, lambasting Teddy on the campaign trail with scathing speeches and vicious takedowns in the press. Teddy was especially worried about how Pulitzer's article would impact his chances of winning in his home state of New York, the key swing state in the 1904 contest. Teddy and Parker were both natives of New York, and Pulitzer's article in the New York World gave Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine in New York, plenty of ammunition to use against Roosevelt and his fellow Republicans in the Empire State. Teddy was specifically worried about the governor's race, which was set to take place in November, right alongside the presidential contest. With the election only a matter of weeks away, Frank W. Higgins, the current lieutenant governor, had barely mounted a campaign at all, choosing instead to rest on the laurels of his reputation. But after the Pulitzer article, Teddy wrote to Higgins and implored him, "Pray get out and put yourself into the canvass at the earliest possible moment. You and I are in the same boat. We shall sink or swim together." Higgins' response, though, might as well have been a shrug. And so, as Higgins continued to limp towards the finish line, Teddy Roosevelt took matters into his own hands and set out to save New York from the clutches of Tammany Hall. It's October 1904 at the offices of the Republican National Committee at 1 Madison Avenue, New York City. Senator Scott, a former senator from West Virginia, has just taken an important phone call from a very important man, President Teddy Roosevelt. The president called and asked for Chairman Cortelyou or Mr. Bliss, the Treasury Secretary. But both men are out, so Roosevelt is stuck with Senator Scott. As the president barks into the wire, Scott does his best to remain calm. "And who am I speaking to?" "My name's Scott, Mr. President." The president doesn't waste time with pleasantries. "What's this I hear about Higgins? I hear there's some danger of his being defeated." Scott does his best to give a measured, honest response. "Well, sir, if the election was now, I fear he would be defeated." Scott knows what he's talking about. A few nights before, Scott spoke at a handful of Republican gatherings. He tried to drum up excitement for Higgins' candidacy for governor, but his attempts fell on deaf ears. Frustrated, the president doesn't like Scott's news. "Well, what's the trouble?" "The committee claims that they have no funds sufficient to carry out the campaign." "Well, can't Mr. Bliss settle that?" "He doesn't have the funds either." "Can't the state committee raise the money?" "No, sir, I'm afraid not." Furious, the president snaps back. "I would rather lose the election in the country than be defeated in my own state." "There's no danger of that, Mr. President, though there is some danger for Mr. Higgins. Though if funds were furnished to the state committee, I have no doubt they can carry out their plan and ensure the election of you both." The president pauses, and after a moment's consideration, "I'll send for Mr. Harrison." E.H. Harrison was one of the biggest Republican donors in New York. He was a man with deep pockets, and to ensure New York voted Republican, Teddy needed him to reach inside and dole out cash. On October 10, 1904, Teddy wrote to Harrison and asked him to pay him a visit. 10 days later, the two men sat down face to face and talked business over dinner at the White House. Whatever words or promises passed between them, Teddy got what he wanted. Harrison committed to raising over $250,000 for the Republican Party in New York, a staggering $7.5 million in today's money, just weeks before the election. Harrison donated $50,000 of his own money and raised the rest from the who's who of Wall Street, including J.P. Morgan. Meanwhile, things were not looking good for Judge Parker. Throughout his campaign, Parker had largely remained home, saying very little and refusing to attack Teddy Roosevelt. In late October, Parker met with a prominent Democratic strategist who delivered the bad news. He told Parker, "Well, you're going to be licked, old fellow, but brace up and make the best fight you can. And when it's over, practice law." When Parker asked how the strategist was so certain he'd be defeated, the strategist looked to the money the Republicans had raised and said, "Why, they have underwritten it." So late in the campaign, Parker finally got off the sidelines and into the fight. In late October, he launched a campaign tour in New York and New Jersey. His speeches earned him much-needed national publicity as he lambasted Wall Street for trying to buy the election and chided Teddy Roosevelt for letting them do it. Then on Thursday, November 3rd, Parker went for the jugular. He accused the Republican National Committee of trying to blackmail him by threatening to release some damaging and improperly acquired information on his finances. Teddy Roosevelt wasted no time. He released an official response just before midnight the very same day, writing, "Mr. Parker's accusations against me are monstrous. The assertion that any knowledge was gained while in any official position is a falsehood. The assertion that there's been any blackmail, direct or indirect, is a falsehood. The assertion that there has been made any pledge or promise in recognition of any contribution from any source is a wicked falsehood. That Mr. Parker should desire to avoid the discussion of principles I can well understand, for it is but the bare truth to say he has not attacked us on any matter of principle, save after first misstating that principle." The next day, Parker realized he had gone too far, and he attempted to walk back his statement, but he was too late. The damage was done. The accusations did not harm Teddy, and if anything, bolstered his chances in New York. On November 8, 1904, Teddy's oldest daughter, Alice, wrote in her journal, "Victory. Triumph. My father is elected. Carried New York State by over 200,000. Higgins elected governor. An unprecedented landslide. It is all colossal." It was unprecedented. Teddy Roosevelt won with 336 electoral votes. He won the popular vote by 2.5 million, the largest percentage in American history in his time. Parker's 5 million votes was only enough to earn him 13 of the 45 states and 140 electoral votes. Socialist candidate Eugene Debs won 0 electoral votes and less than 500,000 popular votes. With his crushing victory, Teddy finally shed the mantle of accidental president. But on election night, he made an egregious error when he announced that he would not seek re-election in 1908, instantly saddling him with a new label, lame duck. And almost immediately after the election, Wall Street came calling, looking to collect on their investment in Teddy. Teddy's decision not to stand in the 1908 contest might have made him a lame duck, but it also freed him from obligations to Wall Street. As one powerful steel magnate once said of Teddy, "We bought the son of a bitch, and then he did not stay bought." After his victory in 1904, Teddy would increasingly push for more progressive reforms. He would break up monopolies and investigate shady trusts. He would advocate for fair trade and pro-labor laws, including a shorter work week, restrictions on child labor, and safety in the workplace. And he would establish a new federal department, the Department of Commerce and Labor, and inside of that, the Bureau of Corporations, a predecessor to the Federal Trade Commission. His progressive actions would alienate Wall Street, create a chasm in the Republican Party, and give rise to a new leader who would promise to pick up where Teddy had left off. This is episode 30 of American Election's Wicked Game, 1904, Rough Rider. On the next episode, the election of 1908. As Teddy Roosevelt's man William Howard Taft seeks to win the first preference primary in American history, the Democrats turn yet again to former Nebraska Congressman William Jennings Bryan. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Election's Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Election's Wicked Game is an Airship production. Hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Sound designed by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Stephen Walters. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and CL Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.
We all love pop culture, but you know what? It can be exhausting. And you know what there isn't enough of is actually funny working comedians talking about all the stuff that we love. And to be honest, love to hate. From what's trending online with celebrities to what's trending online, well, because TikTok told us so. Hi, guys. I'm comedian Justin Martindale, the host of the Just Saying podcast with Justin Martindale on the Comedy Store Network, the mecca of comedy. And each week, I sit down with some of the funniest people you know, and we talk about all of the things happening right now in pop culture. And we have the best guests, from Leslie Jones to Katya to Zainab Johnson and Pete Holmes. We have them all. We break down the hottest stories, the drama, and are unafraid doing so and say what everybody else is thinking. Just Saying with Justin Martindale, coming to you live on the Sunset Strip from the Comedy Store in West Hollywood. So check us out on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you there. You won't be disappointed. Just saying.